The time is now for the Dr. Bob Sports Podcast. I am Tanner. I am our head of analytics, and I am in my 8th year working alongside Bob to originate our NFL and college basketball bets. And today, as always, I am joined by our digital media specialist, Grant. 8 division previews down, and we are finally here. Week 1, baby.
Yeah, week 1, finally here, pumped up for it. We are actually recording a little early because I'm going to watch the banner get raised at the Chiefs opener. So we had to get in a couple days early, but pumped for that, pumped for football.
Yeah, it's Wednesday afternoon. So if you want to see all the final projections, ins and outs, and we'll talk about injuries a little bit later in the episodes. If you want to see all that, go to drbobsports.com and click on the free analysis page. We'll have updated projections later on in the weekend.
Yeah, well, let's jump right in here, and we are going to come out firing with the free bet of the week. And last year on the podcast, this segment went 6-2 on sides and totals.
And we're going to start with Jacksonville plus 3.5. That's good to minus 120 odds or better. This is a strong opinion we released to clients last week. And I just think Trevor Lawrence and Jacksonville's passing offense had a lot of factors that should regress positively for them in 2024. And you remember, they already were 14th in EPA per dropback last year when they ranked second in fumbles lost rate, 27th in EPA from yards after catch. They were only 21st in red zone scoring percentage, and they led the NFL in EPA lost due to drop passes. Plus, Trevor played through a knee bruise, a high ankle sprain, a concussion. He missed that one game with the AC joint sprain. So it's just all those sorts of things. And the Jags already finished 14th in EPA per dropback. So I think this could be sneaky, one of the better passing offenses in the league going into 2024.
Yeah, people are way too down on him. I mean, last year he had 14 interceptions, and 4 of those came off tip balls. 6 came from miscommunications with receivers. So this is a group that should be a lot better in 2024.
I think so. I mean, they drafted Brian Thomas in the first round. They bring in Gabe Davis, who is a little bit underrated. Remember, he finished 20th in EPA per target last year with the Bills, and they retained their best 2 guys. Christian Kirk already ranked 6th in yards per route run, and Evan Ingram was 7th among tight ends in success rate.
Yeah, and we also think the Jags did a pretty good job of building up his blocking in front of him.
Right. I mean, so it was a lot of quick game last year because Doug Peterson really didn't trust his offensive line. Now, they did a good job. They ranked 2nd in pass blocking efficiency in the 7 weeks that they had starting left tackle Cam Robinson because they were just getting the ball out so fast. But this season, I think the Jags offensive line takes a step forward. It's right tackle Anton Harrison's 2nd year. They bring in center Mitch Morse, who was 5th in pass blocking grade by PFF last season. I think Trevor Lawrence should have enough time in the pocket to hit explosive plays downfield this season. We saw that in the preseason. He had an average 9.4 air yards per attempt compared to last year, just a 7.1 yard average depth of target. So this improved offensive line will help with the verticality in Jacksonville's offense.
Yeah, and Miami's defense has 111 pressures out the door with Christian Wilkins and linebacker Andrew Van Ginkel gone. So the starting edge defender Bradley Chubb is also out to start the season, and Jalen Phillips will likely be on a snap count. Remember, we saw him get hurt late in the year, but that leaves defensive tackle Zach Sealer as the only fully healthy player left on this defense to get more than 25 pressures last year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Miami's bringing in new defensive coordinator Anthony Weaver. He's going to have his work cut out for him up front there. Now, they do add Kendall Fuller at cornerback, who was pretty solid, right? He was 9th in PFF coverage grade in 2023. So Miami's secondary is looking pretty good, but I just think the depleted trenches on both sides of the ball is going to hurt this Dolphins team in the first month of the season because it's not just the defensive line. The offensive line lost starting center Connor Williams and starting guard Robert Hunt from last season. It's getting even shakier now with Isaiah Wynn out to start the year, and his backup, Liam Eichenberg, surrendered a 5% pressure rate in 2023 compared to Wynn's just 2% pressure rate. Now you're getting a little bit concerned about that depleted interior line for the Dolphins. The Jaguars brought in Eric Armstead, at defensive tackle. He ranked 10th in pass rushing efficiency with the 49ers last year. I think Tua's constantly going to have his pocket collapsing in this game, given the backups and new faces along this Miami interior offensive line.
Yeah, Jacksonville's new defensive coordinator, Ryan Nielsen, had the Falcons consistently rated better than average in the market last season, despite their best player, defensive tackle Grady Jarrett, being out for half the year.
Right. That was impressive to see what Ryan Nielsen did with that unit last year. He specializes in the defensive line. And along with Eric Armstead, we talked about earlier, the Jags already have former number one pick Trayvon Walker and Josh Hines-Allen, who ranked third in pass rushing efficiency last year. So there's some horses up front for Ryan Nielsen to work with. It all comes out here. Our model favors the Dolphins by just 2.5 with a predicted total of 47.8 points. And the Jaguars apply to a 71-28-3 against the spread week one angle that Bob has been playing for years. So we get a little bit of line value with the model, a little bit of matchup value with that interior pressure, a little bit of technical analysis value. All that's going to net out to us liking the Jags here in week one.
I love it. Don't sleep on the Jags. But let's shift it over to our next segment. We've got the injury watch, and we're going to start with the Monday Nighter. And there's a ton going on for both these teams here, but we do know that Brandon Ayuk and Trent Williams are signed, and they should be ready to go.
Yes. But outside of those guys, it feels like we've been waiting all August for those two to settle, but there's still a lot more to figure out going into this game. And you can check back on the website later in the weekend to see what the final prediction is for it, because we're still monitoring if Hassan Reddick is going to suit up. It's looking like that's not going to happen. And the Jets lost this offseason Bryce Huff, John Franklin Myers, Quentin Jefferson. Those three combined for 145 pressures last year. Reddick was crucial to stabilizing New York's defensive line, so it's vital they get him on the field as soon as possible. And also with New York, we're going to be monitoring Mike Williams' snap count. I mean, Robert Saleh says Mike Williams will be available in week one, but he's not going to be 100%. Quote, we're going to be very smart with how we use him, but he's definitely going to be plenty available to make his mark felt. So is that Mike Williams playing 30% of snaps? Is that Mike Williams playing 80% of snaps? That's going to be pretty telling because the Jets don't have a ton of receiver depth behind Mike Williams. And then for San Francisco, safety Talanoa Hufanga suffered a torn ACL in November. Remember, he was all pro in 2022. He's worth a half point to this defense. The 49ers surrendered 0.17 EPA per dropback more after Hufanga went down last season.
Yeah, last thing on this game, I mean, the 49ers hope defensive ends Leonard Floyd and Yetur Gross-Matos will be healthy enough to play in the season opener after both players left the final exhibition game with sprained knees. But shifting over to our next player here, we've got TJ Hawkinson, and he tore his ACL and MCL in his right knee late last year, and he won't be available for the Vikings for probably the first part of their season.
Yeah. And Hawkinson averaged 1.89 yards per route run last year. That was fourth among tight ends. Our metrics have Hawkinson worth 0.7 points. So a little bit of a ding to the Vikings offense here at the start of the season.
Yeah, and looking at the Cowboys here, Deron Bland out for the next 6 to 8 weeks with a stress fracture in his foot.
Yeah, and that's not good news for new Cowboys defensive coordinator Mike Zimmer. He runs that base 4-3 scheme and his famous AA gap nickel packages that he loves to use on third downs in those passing situations. But what he does behind those is a lot of press man, which would normally line up well with this secondary when you're looking at Trayvon Diggs and Deron Bland. But Bland out means that it's going to be backup rookie 5th round pick Kalen Carson running those press man coverages. That does not sound good to me. And I mean, Bland, he was really good for the Cowboys last year. He led the NFL with 9 receptions. He's worth 0.6 points by our metrics over the backup Carson.
Yeah, that's probably not great for them. But the next team, Jamar Chase, what is going on here? What are you thinking about his situation? I mean, by the time we're recording this, he's not signed, but he is at practice.
Yes. So he's practicing. I think he's going to probably play in week one. We saw the market dip all the way down to Bengals minus 7.5, but then a ton of Bengals money came in when Jamar Chase hit the practice field today on Wednesday. Now, if Chase isn't out there, it's a big problem for the Bengals. Paul Diener, Bengals beat writer for The Athletic, said Cincinnati's not going to put their first round pick Burton out there or even make him active on game day unless they feel comfortable he's preparing in meetings. Which, I mean, he kind of had a few character concerns coming out of the draft, which is why he slipped. And it's like, if he's not even preparing in meetings right now, they clearly don't trust the guy. Dana went on to say, it sounds far more likely a redshirt year lies ahead than anything else for Burton, who they would count on as Chase's backup. But if Burton's not going to be ready, if they don't trust him, then it's looking like Trenton Irwin, which is a big gap between Jamar Chase. That's again about a difference of about a point a game for the Bengals. And I think that's why we saw so much Patriots money come in the market earlier in this week when there was question marks around Chase. Now, if Chase is out, it sets up really nicely for T. Higgins. For all those that own him in fantasy or are playing DFS, T. Higgins averages 102 receiving yards per game in his 5 games without Jamar Chase thus far in his career.
Yeah, that's one to keep an eye on, especially for your fantasy games. But let's shift it over to our next segment here. We've got stock up, stock down, and whose stock are you buying right now?
I'm buying the Carolina Panthers offense stock. I know this sounds a little stinky to some people, but remember, we're buying from an extremely low place, and I think they've got a real chance to improve this season. Remember, Carolina's whole offseason was about seeing what they have in Bryce Young because year one was such a disaster. The turnaround would not be unprecedented. Remember, we saw Jared Goff go from averaging 3.8 yards per pass play as a rookie to 7.2 yards per pass play in year 2. And I don't think Dave Canales is on the same level as Sean McVay schematically, but we even saw guys like Mitch Trubisky improve dramatically in his second year once they hired Matt Nagy. And I don't think everyone thinks that Matt Nagy is a great scheme guy over Dave Canales. So I like Bryce Young to turn around with this new group, especially with guys that they're bringing in.
Yeah, I mean, the Panthers used their first-round pick on Xavier Legette. They also brought in wide receiver Deontay Johnson, who rated 12th in his ESPN open score based on tracking data.
Yeah, and Carolina's interior offensive line was responsible for a league-high 64% of the pressures in 2023. So they replaced both guards. They bring in Damian Lewis. They bring in Robert Hunt, who conceded just 2 pressures on 89 true sets last year. And Hunt finished top 10 in run blocking grade by PFF. So those two are going to stabilize the pocket for Young, and interior protection is a lot more important for Young because he's shorter than most quarterbacks. So you add it all up. I like the receivers you mentioned. I like the interior linemen, the 2 new guards. Those all 4 of those guys are worth about 2 points to the Panthers' offensive rating. So they were 5 points worse than average offense in market last year, and now I think they're only about 3 points worse than average. And I'm not sure everyone's caught up to that fact yet.
No, I don't think they are. I think most people have Bryce Young dead to him, but remember, this is the first overall pick just last year, so there's a lot of hope here. But let's shift it over, and whose stock are you going to be selling this week?
Okay, I'm selling Tennessee's offensive turnaround. That narrative, I'm selling it. And we've seen this total come up a few points from open because there's so much optimism for Tennessee's offense. After they hired new head coach Brian Callahan, everyone thinks they're going to turn into this, passing offense. And because Callahan was Cincinnati's offensive coordinator last year when they led the NFL in pass rate over expectation. However, I see the Titans with a banged up DeAndre Hopkins in week 1. He won't be 100%. Kind of similar to the Commanders' offense last season. You remember, Washington's offense led the league with a 66% pass rate in 2023, but they finished just 25th in scoring. That's kind of how I see it going for the Titans this year. Sam Howell had a 9.6% sack rate last year, and Will Levis's sack rate was even worse at 9.9%. Both those guys don't have great pocket presence. Will Levis was hit on 26% of his dropbacks last year, the league average, which is 15%.
Yeah, and the Titans did try to make improvements to that offensive line. I mean, they signed center Lloyd Cushenberry, and then they drafted tackle J.C. Latham, but they're still rolling with Dylan Raduns and Nicholas Petit-Frere on that right side.
Yeah, neither of those guys have any business starting in the NFL. Raduns has a career 8% pressure rate allowed. Petit-Frere has a career 9% pressure rate allowed. And you look at it, who's lining up across from the right side of the Titans offensive line in this game? Montez Sweat, who had 54 pressures on the right against right side of offensive lines last year, 7th most in the NFL.
Yeah, I mean, Chicago's defense was 5th in EPA per play in the back half of last season after trading for Sweat.
Yeah. And now this summer, the Bears brought in former All-Pro safety Kevin Byard to an already promising young secondary headlined by cornerback Jalen Johnson, who allowed a league low 0.38 yards per cover snap last season. And I think Johnson is going to contain the Titans' healthy receiver, Calvin Ridley, who averaged just 1.57 yards per route run last year in Jacksonville. So I think Ridley's going to be locked up. Hopkins still nursing the knee. It's going to be a lot of dink and dunk. I don't think they've got explosiveness. You look at it, Callahan's Bengals last year were last in the NFL with just a 6.3 yard average depth of target. I just do not see the Titans hitting a ton of deep shots in this game, which is going to really slow this down, force them into long drives. And I think the Bears are going to clamp up when that happens.
Yeah, I think a lot of people remember Will Levis for that game that he had a bunch of deep shots. But looking at Chicago's defense here, they built around coverage linebackers, and they also have a schematic advantage versus this, the new look that Tennessee's going to be rocking with.
Right, because Will Levis, let me take a step backwards. The Bengals offense was two different offenses last year. Okay. It was when Joe Burrow was in the game. It was in Jake Browning was in the game. Now, we know that Will Levis is not Joe Burrow. So it's going to look a lot more like the Jake Browning offense for Brian Callahan this year. And we saw that in the preseason. Will Levis had a 36% play action rate this preseason, which would have led the NFL if he sustained that rate throughout a whole season. That would have led the NFL last year. But you look at Matt Eberflus's defense, they specialize in coaching the linebackers to not bite on play action. That goes all the way back to his time in Indianapolis. Just 23% of Chicago's first downs allowed last season were on play action. That was the 9th fewest in the league. So if the Titans want to roll out this new style of offense, this is the worst defense to do it against, because that's exactly what Matt Eberflus specializes in.
Yeah, I like that. It's going against the grain a little bit. I think people were getting a little too hot and heavy with that one. I heard people talking about betting them 45-1 for the highest scoring team of the week, but I don't know if I would be betting that. But let's shift it over to our next segment. We've got the weather of the week. And what are you seeing out there, Tan?
Well, it looks like it's going to be a little stormy, little sticky in Tampa Bay, so I'm not expecting a ton of points in that Jaden Daniels highly anticipated debut. Another weather game this week to monitor is in Buffalo, where it's looking like 18 miles per hour sustained winds and a slight chance of rain. So as we record this podcast on Wednesday afternoon, this total is hanging on at 48 because people are really ready to bet Arizona shootouts this year. Not a lot of confidence in that defense for the Cardinals, and people, are really excited about this Drew Petzing, Kyler Murray offense. But if the winds hang in here, it's not this total cannot stay at 48. I've got the scoring conditions in this game more than a point worse than a typical game in Buffalo, which is already one of the lowest scoring environments in the league.
Yeah, that's not good. Well, while we're talking about home game conditions, I want to ask you, what are you going to do with this game with the Raiders and Chargers? I think we're expecting to see a lot of silver and black in the stamps for Jim Harbaugh's first game.
Yeah, we're giving Los Angeles the lowest home field advantage of the week at just 0.8 points. The Chargers obviously have the worst home field advantage in the NFL, and it's probably as worse as it can be when they play the Raiders because there's so many Raiders fans in Southern California. But the Raiders are still the team that has to travel. I don't think you can, give the Raiders any points. I would say 0.8 points of home field advantage is the lowest we'd ever go in any game. Just because, it's probably going to be more Raiders fans in there than Chargers fans for Jim Harbaugh's debut. But yeah, the travel is what actually dictates a lot of home field advantage. So we're still going to give the Chargers, a little bit less than a point there. But we've seen a lot of Raiders action come into the market leading up to this game.
All right. Well, let's shift it over to our next segment. We've got the DraftKings player of the slate. And who do you have for us?
Well, he's going to have low ownership for tournaments, and that is why I am targeting Sam Darnold at $5,200 in DraftKings. The weather conditions looked solid on the turf in East Rutherford this week. In New York's defense, remember, they lost safety Xavier McKinney, who conceded a passer rating of just 52 into his coverage last season. That was 6th among safeties. Now the Giants are starting Dane Belton and Jason Pinnock at safety, as well as a third-round rookie at nickelback. I mean, this secondary is such a disaster for new Giants defensive coordinator Shane Bowen. Sam Darnold is the third cheapest starter on the slate. I think this is a spot to get ahead of the market on how poor New York secondary is going into this season. And you remember, in 3 starts for Kevin O'Connell last season, Nick Mullins averaged 370 yards per game. So it's certainly possible that we see Darnold blow up in this start against one of the worst secondaries he's going to face all season long.
That's an awesome pick. I love that. Well, let's head down to Brazil for our primetime preview between the Packers and Eagles. And this is a neutral site game in Sao Paulo, and the field surface is grass.
Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned the field surface there, because sometimes these international games, particularly the one in Mexico, actually, and now that I think about it, in the Tottenham Stadium in England, or when they used to play at the Twickenham Stadium, those, on those old fields, they can sometimes the turf is so long, the grass is so long that it really slows game down. So we've seen some over money come in here. I'm not willing to bet that. I'm not really to follow that money, just because you just don't know what the surface is going to look like in these international games. I'm not going to bet under, just because it's a complete unknown, but that's something to consider. Now, let's look at these offenses. Heading into last year's postseason, Green Bay's offense was rated slightly below average in market. Then Jordan Love averaged 1.13 EPA per play in the wild card round, which was the most of any quarterback in the last 2 decades. And now, with Love and the young receivers another year older, the market has moved this offense 2 points just based off of one offseason and one playoff game.
Looking at the Eagles, they brought in new defensive coordinator Vic Fangio, and they might have the best cornerback depth in the NFL to cover those young Packers receivers.
Yeah, I mean, Philadelphia used their first 2 draft picks on cornerbacks. They already have Darius Slay, who's made a Pro Bowl in 6 of the last 7 seasons. And Isaiah Rodgers might be the most underrated cornerback in the league as he comes off this year-long gambling suspension. Remember, he ranked 9th in successful coverage over expected in 2022, and he conceded a league-low target rate into his coverage. Then at safety, the Eagles bring back C.J. Gardner-Johnson, who led the NFL in interceptions in 2022 with the Eagles.
Yeah, and Philadelphia's pass rush had 109 pressures walk out the door with Fletcher Cox's retirement, and then they traded Hassan Reddick. So what are they going to do to try and replace that production?
They brought in Bryce Huff, but he's more of a pass rush specialist. He played 43% of his snaps on third down last year, and because he was able to tee off and know that quarterbacks were passing, he led the NFL with a 22% pressure rate last season. He actually led the NFL in pressure rate in 2022 also. So it's 2 straight years that he's led the NFL in pressure rate. He's not as well-rounded as Reddick. He's not going to give you much in run support. He's probably not going to give you as many snaps overall, but I think he's going to at least match Reddick's pass rushing production.
All right, well, looking at Philly's offense, they got a new offensive coordinator, and Jalen Hurts was quoted saying that 95% of the offense is new.
Yeah. And I mean, a lot of stuff just didn't work in that Brian Johnson offense last year. So it will be interesting to see in this Brazil game what the Eagles look like. I mean, their new offensive coordinator, Kellen Moore's weakness has been run game design, particularly in the back half of seasons. But you'd expect top offensive line coach and run game coordinator Jeff Stoutland to help in that department. Now, here's what Moore is going to help the Eagles with. He's charged with finding Jalen Hurts answers against the blitz. And I think he's going to be able to do that, especially because they bring in new running back Saquon Barkley to get involved as a receiver. So the Eagles gave Barkley a 3-year, $38 million deal, which is the exact same as the Falcons gave wide receiver Darnell Mooney. Now, the running back depreciation might have gone too far. I think Barkley is going to be more effective as a receiver than Darnell Mooney will be, give you more production as a receiver than Darnell Mooney would give the Falcons. So I think this is a smart buy low for Howie Roseman, especially because it addresses a big weakness that the Eagles have, which is they didn't have any quick dump off answers against, cover zero looks. And in the run game, Barkley's going to be a big factor too. I mean, he was running behind an awful offensive line last year, but he averaged 0.3 rush yards over expected based on the blocking he got, which was a half yard per carry, better than DeAndre Swift and Kenneth Gainwell, the Eagles running backs last year.
Yeah, and Philly's offensive line loses Hall of Famer Jason Kelce, but they had already drafted his heir apparent with Cam Jurgens.
Let's look at it. Philadelphia's offense was rated top 5 in 2022 when they made that Super Bowl run. Even last year, with all those, struggles down the stretch, they were still top 10 in the market at the end of last season. I think Barkley and better play calling make up for some of that gap that they lose from the loss of Jason Kelce. Also, the Eagles have a matchup advantage versus the Packers' new defensive coordinator, Jeff Hafley, who ran more single high safety looks in college football last season, or not just last season, during his entire time at Boston College than any other team.
Yeah, and Green Bay leaned into this philosophy switch by giving center field safety Xavier McKinney a 4-year, $68 million deal, which was the only major deal for a safety in the whole offseason.
Yeah. And I'm looking at just last season. Boston College had a 43% cover one rate last year. The Packers called a 30% cover one rate in the preseason. So, if it's somewhere in between there, Dallas led the NFL last year with a 34% cover one rate. So we could see this team being, one of the biggest cover one man teams in the NFL if it's somewhere between what Hafley did at Boston College and what they did in the preseason. You look at it, the Eagles offense averaged 25% more yards per play versus cover one last season than all other coverages because wide receivers A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith torch man. So just from a model perspective, we have the Eagles as a 2.4 point favorite with a predicted total of 49.7, but certainly seems like the matchups are on the Eagles side here.
I like that. Well, we've got one more thing, and that is your primetime prop. And last year, your primetime props went 13-8.
Yep. Yeah. And I'm going to start this year with the primetime prop. A.J. Brown over 70.5 receiving yards. We just talked about how much cover one we expect the Packers to play under new defensive coordinator Jeff Hafley. And A.J. Brown had the third most yards versus man coverage in 2023. Kellen Moore loves to feature a receiver in his offense. Keenan Allen averaged 11.5 targets per game last season. So we could see a healthy dose of A.J. Brown in this matchup. And A.J. Brown already went over this number in 10 of his 16 games last year, not including when he rested in the back half of that Week 18 game. So, it seems pretty low, and it seems like a great matchup. Kellen Moore is going to feature him over 70.5 receiving yards for A.J. Brown.
I love that pick. Well, I think that will do it for our Week 1 preview. So make sure to head over to drbobsports.com. We've got all of our free analysis posted there. So we'll be back next Friday to preview Week 2. And as always, thanks for watching, and make sure to like and subscribe.